This is a true story. The reconstructions are based on original cockpit voice recordings and eyewitness accounts.
No family wants to lose a loved one, daughter, son. None of us think it's going to happen to our family. We read about these horrible crashes and we think, thank God, you know, and chances are it won't happen to us. The odds are in our favor.
You got it? What are you doing? It just got worse, okay?
In January 2000, an Air Alaska jet with 88 passengers and crew suffered a catastrophic failure that tore it from the sky. A shocking chain of negligence and error had led to disaster. When a whistleblower mechanic from the airline tried to sound the alarm about faulty maintenance procedures, he was suspended from his job. The investigation exposes deeply worrying shortcomings in maintenance and regulation that afflict the airline industry. It shows how a series of devastating errors combine to produce a tragic accident, one that could happen again.
Release it.
Puerto Vallarta is a popular holiday resort on the Mexican Pacific coast, one of several Mexican destinations served by Alaska Airlines. Colleen Worley went there to celebrate a family birthday. The 34-year-old was a keen traveler who spoke Spanish well and had visited Mexico many times. Colleen and the other holidaymakers returning from Puerto Vallarta settle in for the 4-hour flight to San Francisco. In the warm afterglow of their holidays, they are looking to the future. Colleen and her fiancé Monty were planning to start a family later that year. The pilots on Flight 261 are very experienced. Both Captain Ted Thompson and First Officer Bill Tansky have thousands of hours flying MD-80s. They know the plane well. The MD-83 is one of a successful group of rear-engined, low-wing planes. Originally launched in 1980, over 1,100 were delivered worldwide.
Flaps? Check, confirmed. Spoilers? Check. Arm.
But on the 31st of January 2000, as they prepared Flight 261, Thompson and Tansky had no idea that deep in the plane's tail lay a critical weakness. Colleen Worley and her fiancé, Monty, were planning their forthcoming wedding.
They had announced their engagement at Christmas time, and so it was a time for everybody to sort of congratulate them, and so we decided we'd have a party for the family.
Abby Miller Bush had visited Mexico with her husband Ryan and their friends to celebrate her new job at Microsoft.
It's hard to describe how joyful a girl she was. She was well known for that care that she had in her, a trait that you can't put a value on.
Dean and I had been there a lot together, and it was the first time that he went without me. Dean taught me how to play. He was always up. He told jokes a lot. People described him kind of as a puppy dog.
Alaska Airlines was a successful carrier with routes up and down the west coast of America and into Mexico. Flight 261 left Puerto Vallarta as a routine flight with no hint of the danger to come. The devastating failure that would bring catastrophe to Flight 261 did not come out of the blue. In fact, it was the culmination of a chain of mistakes that began years earlier. Maintenance procedures at the company had come under scrutiny 2 years earlier when a whistleblower set off an investigation by the Federal Aviation Administration. But the day Flight 261 left Puerto Vallarta, the investigation was still underway and the whistleblower suspended from his work. Shortly after takeoff, Captain Thompson and First Officer Tansky get the first sign of trouble. The horizontal stabilizer on the tailplane won't move. The pilots carry out a standard checklist to try and free it.
Stabilizer trim switch.
Normal.
Circuit breakers. Reset if tripped.
D9, D10, D11, okay.
The stabilizer on the MD-83 is the 40-foot wide horizontal surface at the front of the tail. It's like another wing. Together with the elevators at the rear of the tail, the stabilizer is used to adjust the angle of the plane in flight. The stabilizer was jammed. Thompson and Tansky assumed there was a fault in the electric motors that move it up and down. They believed they could fix the problem. They had no idea they were in great danger.
What they dealt with was something that really snuck up on them. It was not supposed to be a big deal. If it had been, they would have turned around and gone back in to the Mexican airfield they came out of. But they were led down this road of accepting this problem as a small problem, so it's perfectly all right to troubleshoot it.
The pilots repeatedly try the two switches that operate the stabilizer. The primary motor activated by the switch on the control stick known as the pickle switch, and the sliding suitcase handles on the central console.
Either system operative.
No.
Both systems inoperative. Consider stab jam. Do not use autopilot.
Check.
Are you declaring an emergency, sir?
Watch all episodes of Ice Pilots. Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
The jammed stabilizer is pushing the aircraft down towards the ground. At 28,500 feet, the pilots switch off the autopilot and fly the plane manually. They have to pull back hard on the control column to lift the nose of the plane up. This requires considerable effort. The plane climbs for the next 7 minutes to its cruising altitude of 32,000 feet. As they fly up the coast, the pilots contact Alaska Maintenance Department for assistance.
Maintenance, we need to know if any faults like this got reported recently for this aircraft.
Whether there are any switches that we might not be aware of that can get those motors turning again.
Roger 261. I
Can verify no history on your aircraft in the past 30 days.
Yeah, we didn't see anything in the logbook. Why don't you move your seat forward? I'll check this pedestal back there. Beyond that, I don't think there's anything we haven't checked.
I use the example of the average layman, I think, can understand. If you try to start your car and it doesn't crank, you try jiggling the key in the socket and then try it again. And I think that the crew was probably understandably going through a lot of these, well, maybe it'll work now, or let's try this, let's try that.
The pilots want to divert to Los Angeles, but Alaska Airlines Dispatch, coordinating the movements of the company's planes, is worried this will upset the busy schedule.
261 Dispatch, if you want to land at LA, of course, for safety reasons, we will do that.
Tell you though, if we land in LA, we're looking at probably an hour and a half. We got a major flow program going right now.
Well, boy, you really put me in a spot up here. I don't want to hear that the flow is the reason you're calling.
Because I'm concerned about overflying suitable airports.
Well, we want to do what's safe, so if that's what you feel is safe, just want to make sure you have all the info.
We might ask if they have a ground school instructor available. We could discuss it with him, and a simulator instructor.
Dispatch 261, we're wondering if we can get some support out of the instructors up there.
Thompson and Tansky now ask for a pilot instructor who might know the solution to their unusual problem.
Stand by.
As they wait for a reply, their frustration begins to show.
Just drives me nuts, you know? Not that I want to go on about it, but it just blows me away. They think we're going to land, they're going to fix it. Now they're worried about the flow. Well, I'm sorry. Just...
So they're putting pressure on you.
Well, no. Yeah.
The pilots need to think about what will happen when they descend for landing. How will the plane behave? Will they be able to control it? But several minutes after requesting help from the ground, they're getting no advice. As Flight 261 approached Los Angeles off the coast, the problems on board were about to get far worse. The pilots on the crippled Air Alaska Flight 261 are flying manually at 32,000 feet in a plane that has a jammed stabilizer that is forcing the plane's nose down. The pilots have another go at freeing up the jammed stabilizer. They switch on both the electric motors that control it.
This'll click it off. Holy!
What are you doing there?
It clicked off.
From 31,000 feet, Flight 261 plunges down for over a minute. The crew battle for control.
It just got what's okay? You're stalled!
At first, they pull back on the control columns to fight the dive. But then the pilots push the aircraft's nose down into the dive to regain control. It's a risky maneuver, pushing the plane's speed to 350 miles an hour.
You gotta release it! You gotta release it!
The pilots slowly bring the plane out of its dive and back under control.
Let's get speed brakes. Give me high pressure pumps.
Okay.
Help me back. Help me back.
Okay.
Center Alaska 261. We're in a dive here.
I've lost control. Vertical pitch.
Alaska 261, say again, sir.
Yeah, we're out of 26,000 feet.
We are in a vertical dive. Not a dive yet, but we have lost vertical control of our airplane. Just help me. Once we get the speed slow, maybe we'll be okay.
Maintaining level flight is difficult. The jam stabilizer keeps pushing the nose of the plane down.
We're at 23.7. Request. Yeah, we got it under control here.
No, we don't.
Okay.
Okay.
To counteract the downward force of the stabilizer, the pilots use the elevators, movable panels at the back of the tail, linked by cable to the control column. The pilots pull with all their might. The fate of the plane hangs on the strength of their arms. In the cabin, frightened passengers try to recover from the terrifying plunge. They have no idea what might happen next. Holiday memories are replaced by the fear of dying.
Dean was one of these people who would talk to whoever was around him. I'm absolutely certain that he was talking to the person that was sitting next to him on the plane. I'm sure that they had a connection.
Colleen was very unique from my other kids, and she loved to travel. She was a beautiful girl.
But here was a 25-year-old who was like she had her own private rocket ship. She was really going places.
In the cockpit, the pilots struggle to control the plane's speed so they can land.
They've got a handful of airplanes. They get her stabilized, and they're now in a situation where they make the decision properly to go in on an emergency landing to Los Angeles International. And they have to be able to slow the airplane up, so you've got to experiment a little bit.
Let's take the speed brakes off.
No, leave them there. It seems to be helping. Damn. Okay, it really wants to pitch down.
Okay.
Don't mess with that.
I agree with you.
With the plane under temporary control, the crew make the fateful decision to do more troubleshooting. They need a block of clear space around the aircraft in case they lose control again. They contact air traffic control.
Alaska 261, say your conditions.
261, we're at 24,000 feet, kind of stabilized. We're slowing down here, and we're going to do a little troubleshooting. Can you give me a block altitude between 20 and 25?
Alaska 261, maintain block altitude flight level 200 through flight level 250.
The pilots know they now have clear airspace above and below the plane. They try to figure out their next move.
You got the airplane. Let me just try it.
Okay.
How hard is it?
I don't know. My adrenaline's going. It was really rough back there for a while.
Yeah, it is. Whatever we did is no good. Let's not do that again.
Yeah, it went to full nose down.
It's worse than it was before?
Yeah, we're in much worse shape now.
The crew know this is no mere electrical problem. From what they've experienced, they assume the stabilizer is now jammed.
I think it's at the stop, full stop, and I'm thinking, can it get any worse? But it probably can. But let's slow it. Let's get down to 200 knots and see what happens.
The crisis is getting worse. Uncertain how the plane will react if they try to slow it down, the pilots must still pull on the elevators to maintain level flight. Captain Thompson once again tries to get help from maintenance.
Maintenance, 261, are you on?
Yeah, 261, this is maintenance.
Okay, we did both the pickle switch and the suitcase handles, and it ran away. It ran away full nose, trimmed down.
Oh, it ran away trimmed down?
Okay, and now we're in a damn pinch, and we're holding it. We're worse than we were before.
You getting full nose trimmed down, but you don't get
No nose trim up, is that correct?
That's affirmed. We went to full nose down, and I'm afraid to try it again to see if it would go in the other direction.
Okay, well, your discretion. If you want to try it, that's okay with me.
If not, that's fine. See you at the gate.
As important as it is to have that ground contact with people with maintenance manuals and experience on the ground and the ability to call up the manufacturer, it's not always going to give you a magic answer. The crew had already gone through every logic tree they possibly could think of.
Maintenance clearly do not appreciate the gravity of the situation. This is the last the crew will hear from them. No one can help the pilots now, as they struggle with the plane's faulty stabilizer. Ever professional, however, they try to put the passengers at ease.
Folks, we have had a flight control problem up front here.
We're working it. That's Los Angeles off to the right there, and that's where we're intended to go. We're pretty busy up here working this situation. I don't anticipate any big problems once we get a couple of subsystems on the line.
But we will be going into LAX, and I anticipate us parking there in about 20 to 30 minutes.
In fact, they will never make it to Los Angeles. A full-blown disaster is about to unfold. After the terrifying 8,000 feet plunge downwards, Alaska 261 has now leveled out.
LA, Alaska 261, we're with you. We're at 22.5. We have a jam stabilizer, and we're maintaining altitude with difficulty. But we can maintain altitude, we think, and our intention is to land at Los Angeles.
The pilots request to be routed out over the Pacific Ocean.
Center, Alaska 261, I need to get down about 10, change my configurations to make sure I can control the jet, and I'd like to do that over the bay here, if I may.
If the worst happens, they don't want to kill people on the ground as well as in the plane.
There are a lot of lives saved that people maybe don't realize by the fact that this aircrew said, let's stay out over the water until we've got this thing completely under control.
As they maneuver over the ocean, the crew again ask air traffic control for clear space around the plane.
Alaska 261, fly a heading of 280 and descend and maintain 17,000.
280 and 17,000 Alaska 261, and we're generally needing a block altitude.
Alaska 261, roger. I need everything picked up and everybody strapped down.
Because I'm gonna unload the aircraft and see if we can regain control that way.
The pilots concentrate on trying to fix the plane.
I'm test flying now.
How's it feel?
It's wanting to pitch over more.
Really?
Yep.
Try flaps, 15, 11?
Now let's go to 11.
Okay, get some power on.
I'm at 250 knots.
Real hard?
No, actually, it's pretty stable right here, see, but we got to get it down to 180.
The crew try to slow the aircraft down to landing speed without losing control, but every move they make could have fatal consequences.
Okay, bring the flaps and the slats back up for me.
Slats too?
Yeah.
Treading a knife edge of control, the pilots are still trying to free up the stabilizer.
What I want to do is get the nose up, and then let the nose fall through, and see if we can stab it when it's unloaded.
The only hope for the passengers is that the pilot's skill and experience can get the plane to Los Angeles Airport.
It's on the stop now, it's on the stop.
Not according to this, it's not.
As one effort after another fails, the crew wonder if the stabilizer is damaged.
The trim might be, and then it might be if something's popped back there.
Yeah.
It might be mechanical damage too. I think if it's controllable, we ought to just try and land it.
Think so? Okay, let's head for LA.
But just as they prepare the plane to land in Los Angeles, something in the tail suddenly breaks.
Did you feel that?
Yep. Okay, give me slats. This is a bitch.
Is it?
Yeah.
The plane dives straight down from 18,000 feet. To avoid collisions, Los Angeles Control has warned the pilots of nearby planes that Alaska 261 is in difficulty. These pilots now report back to the tower.
That plane has just started to do a big, huge plunge.
Yep.
Yes, sir. He is definitely in a nose-down position, descending quite rapidly. Definitely out of control. Plane's inverted, sir. Okay. Yeah, he's inverted.
The pilots can barely reach the controls. The plane is now upside down, but they believe they might be able to roll it out of the dive.
They tried to fly the airplane even upside down. They never for a moment believed that they could not find a way to control this airplane.
I'm pushing. Okay, let's keep rudder. Left rudder, left rudder. Can't reach it. Okay. Right rudder, right rudder.
Plane was being knocked from side to side. It turned upside down. It was spinning. Persons were being thrown against the walls of the plane, falling out of their seats, and the cockpit voice recorder screaming. Unbelievable, horrible last few minutes of their lives.
Are we flying? We're flying. We're flying. Tell them what we're doing. Let me just. Damn. At least upside down, we're flying. Yeah.
And it was so violently upside down that the pilots were hanging from their shoulder straps. Passengers don't have shoulder straps.
Here we go.
And he just hit the water. Yes, sir. He hit the water. He's down.
After a terrifying 60-second dive, Flight 261 hit the Pacific Ocean at over 250 miles an hour. Rescue helicopters were soon at the crash site, but there were no survivors. The plane had broken up on impact. 88 passengers and crew, including 3 young children, died instantly. Fred Miller lost his daughter Abby and her husband Ryan.
These people suffered on the way down. This was not a pretty way to die. One witness who I met, a jogger on the beach down at Port Hueneme, he said, "You look like you lost somebody." And I said, "I did, my daughter." He said, "You know, I saw the plane go down." He said the plane was inverted and twisting and flipping, and then he said it spun at times, almost like a top. And he said, to think people, somebody who has a life to live is in there, dying. He said, it's one of the most horrifying memories I'll ever have.
Susan De Silva lost her husband, Dean.
I know that they went through a horrible, horrible experience. This was a violent end these people suffered. There were no bodies that were intact or even close to intact. And they were conscious for a long time before it all came apart.
Colleen Worley died along with her fiancé, Monty.
As a mother, keep waiting for your child to come home. And Colleen had traveled so much in her life that it was unusual not to have her just walk in the door. All this time you're thinking something caused this, something made this happen, and I want to find out who's responsible for this.
The investigation into Flight 261 immediately got underway, but the wreckage lay 700 feet down, so National Transportation Board officials called on Navy submersibles to retrieve the debris from the seabed.
We set up a base of operations, and we had a remote operating vehicle with the side-scanning sonar, which they used to map the debris field and get an idea of how widely spread the wreckage was.
At the National Transportation Safety Board headquarters in Washington, the investigators' immediate concern was to find out what had brought the plane down. The first clues came from the cockpit voice recordings.
LA, Alaska 261, we're with you. We're at 22.5. We have a jam stabilizer, and we're maintaining altitude with difficulty.
We immediately suspected some problem in the tail of the airplane, which is where the controls are. Or something was wrong back there, and that was the key piece of wreckage to look for.
The MD-83 that crashed was a revised version of the Douglas Corporation's popular DC-9, over 2,000 of which were delivered to airlines worldwide. The engines were at the rear, and the distinctive T-shaped tail was an essential element of the design.
In a big turbojet aircraft, one of the rather brilliant elements of the design is that since you're going to be loading passengers and cargo, you want to be able to have that aircraft loaded a little nose heavy or a little tail heavy. Well, in order to do that, you actually had to have that entire stabilizer moving. But the ones that are the most difficult to engineer are the T-tailed airplanes, where you have the vertical stabilizer and the horizontal sitting on top. And we call that stabilizer trim. And that is an essential element of what makes these aircraft so usable.
In the MD-83, a motorized jackscrew in the tail moves the horizontal stabilizer up and down. As the stabilizer moves up, the nose of the plane moves down. As the stabilizer moves down, the nose moves up. But what role had the 2-foot jackscrew played in the loss of Flight 261? The investigators were anxious to inspect it as soon as it was recovered from the sea bed.
The jackscrew wasn't mated with the nut that it screws into. It was just by itself. And the nut was found in another piece of structure a few feet away from where the jackscrew was. To have a screw separate itself from a nut with very thick threads surprised us. Secondly, we noticed that there was a curled piece of brass around the jackscrew. And all of the threads that you can see here, these ridges, were gone. They had been stripped out. And the remnants of those were found coiled on the jackscrew.
Once the thread had been stripped off the nut, the jackscrew could no longer turn. The pilots could not have known the real nature of the problem.
The crew was confronted with a situation that had never occurred before. There is no failed jackscrew procedure in the quick reference handbooks that they have available. There is no training for it.
When the jackscrew jammed, the crew were unable to adjust the stabilizer.
We felt that it was due to the fact that these nut threads had worn away and it was just too hard for that jackscrew under the power of the electric motor to turn. That gave the flight crew an indication that there was a problem.
The crew knew they had a problem in the tailplane, but they had no idea what. 2 motors controlled the jackscrew. They tried each in turn, but the pilot's attempts to free the jam stabilizer inadvertently made their situation worse.
We're at 23.7. Request. Yeah, we got it under control here.
No, we don't.
Where they went wrong was that they wanted to try both the alternate and the primary trim motors at the same time.
When the pilots switched both the electric motors on, the jackscrew moved, but the threads had given way and the jackscrew was now held only by a single retaining nut. From here on, the plane was doomed.
That end nut was never designed to hold the loads generated aerodynamically by the airplane.
Let's get speed brakes. Give me high pressure pumps.
Okay.
Now we know, in the glaring light of hindsight, now when we turn the situation around in time and look back, we can see that this aircrew and no aircrew should have ever been fooling with the trim and trying to run it back and forth.
The retaining nut grew weaker and weaker.
Then, finally, through the loads beating down on that nut, the nut finally failed.
Feel that? Yep. Okay, give me slats.
The jackscrew slid completely out of the Acme nut, allowing the horizontal stabilizer to move well beyond its aerodynamic limits.
This is a bitch. Is it? Yeah.
The stabilizer forced the plane down, and now, completely out of control, it rolled over into its final dive.
Okay, let's keep rudder. Left rudder. Left rudder. I can't reach it.
This crew was working to recover the aircraft right down to the water. I mean, they did not give up the whole way down through the descent.
Here we go.
It was clear to the investigators that the failure of the Jackscrew was the only explanation for the plane's erratic flight path and final dive. But why had this happened? Why had the Jackscrew failed? The investigators began looking deeper and deeper into the condition of the faulty Jackscrew on Flight 261. What had caused it to fail?
There was no lubrication or visible grease on the working area of the screw. That was surprising and strange.
The discovery of no grease on the Jackscrew alarmed the investigators. They alerted the Federal Aviation Administration, who ordered an immediate check on all MD-80s in the USA. This led to a shocking discovery. At Alaska Airlines, in 6 of its fleet of 34 planes, the Jackscrew assembly needed to be replaced after failing new inspections.
No grease is the culprit. No grease or inadequate grease is the only thing that can give you that wear rate.
A simple lack of grease led to the failure of the Jackscrew and the loss of 88 lives. But why did this happen at Alaska Airlines? The investigators' attention now switched to the company's maintenance program. What emerged was deeply worrying.
We interviewed all the mechanics who had worked on these airplanes. We knew that they had been falsifying records or not doing the work they had indicated.
The mechanics at Alaska complained that they were pressured to keep the planes in the air, or that their recommendations were overruled by supervisors. Some alleged that records were altered to show work done that was not done. Alaska has long been one of America's most successful airlines, but in the early 1990s, the economic downturn hit the company hard. Its response was to slash costs to revive its fortunes. Pilots, maintenance workers, management and others had to make sacrifices. Jobs were lost, pay was cut, and every hour aircraft spent on the ground was seen as waste. 2 years of aggressive axe-wielding saw costs come down by $80 million. Profits leapt. It was a corporate triumph.
In Alaska's case, in the early 90s, this airline had to do an incredible job of reforming itself from a fairly high-cost carrier to a lower-cost carrier that could compete head-on with Southwest Airlines and with others. And they did it. They did it brilliantly. Nobody really believed that it could happen.
Alaska Airlines began flying the planes more intensively. It doubled the average daily use of its fleet. But keeping the planes in the air earning money put maintenance schedules under pressure. John Leotine was a former lead mechanic at Alaska Airlines Oakland maintenance facility, where he worked for over 8 years. Leotine felt that the new pressures on maintenance put passengers' lives at risk. He was to pay dearly for expressing those concerns. We have used an actor to portray his experiences based on his sworn evidence to the NTSB. Leontine claimed that planes were pushed back into service too quickly. Sometimes, rather than wait for a replacement part or repair, supervisors passed planes fit for service, free to carry passengers up into the air. In October 1998, over 15 months before the crash, John Leontine became so worried that he did something that would change his life forever. He reported Alaska Airlines to the U.S. Department of Transportation, alleging violations in maintenance procedures.
There were very few voices at Alaska who had concerns about the maintenance. There should have been more, and there should have been people listening. John Leontine is a hero in my book.
In December 1999, over a year before the crash, the FAA and Department of Transportation officials moved on Alaska Airlines. The case was referred to federal prosecutors, and the FBI raided Alaska's maintenance facilities and seized thousands of records. The raid was the opening shot in a federal grand jury investigation that would last 3 years. No criminal charges were brought against the airline. Alaska officials denied that any unsafe planes were put into service or that passengers' lives were ever at risk. But the investigation revealed hundreds of violations of federal regulations. Alaska Airlines was fined. The FAA insisted on changes to the company's maintenance and safety procedures. The FAA also suspended 2 supervisors for falsifying records. Like other whistleblowers, John Leontine would pay heavily for his efforts to save lives. Alaska put him on paid leave from his job, losing him thousands of dollars in regular overtime earnings. Then in January 2000, John Leontine saw his worst nightmare come true. The kind of accident he had tried to prevent now took place just off the California coast. After the loss of Flight 261, Leontine went back to his private work records. Incredibly, he found he had a direct link to the crashed airliner. 2 years before, at the plane's last overhaul, he had ordered that the jackscrew on this very aircraft be replaced. He then went off shift. When investigators examined the record, they found that Leontine's recommendation had been overruled by the next shift and the plane put back into service. It would be 2 years before the next overhaul, but time ran out. 4 months before the overhaul was due, Flight 261 crashed. Alaska Airlines labeled Leontine a disruptive influence. He sued the company for libel. Alaska settled, but Leontine could no longer work in the industry he loved.
I get calls almost every week of somebody saying, should I blow the whistle? And I always tell them, you need to know, you need to be prepared to find another line of work, because you will not work in the industry and you will not work in the government. In most cases, it's almost impossible to be a whistleblower and survive your career.
As the investigators continued their work into Flight 261, they made another disturbing discovery about the drive to cut costs at Alaska Airlines. To keep planes flying more intensively, Alaska had dramatically extended the intervals between service. This was significant because when a plane is designed, every part has a schedule listing when it is serviced and when it must be replaced.
You're supposed to go in and inspect every so many hours, and that's different on parts all over the planes. Some things you have to look at after every flight. Other things have to be inspected every 2 or 3 days.
In 1996, Alaska Airlines extended the intervals between MD-80 Jackscrew inspections by 400%. Before 1996, Jackscrews were inspected every 600 flight hours. Now there was over 2,500 hours between each service.
If you had 600 hours between inspection points and greasing points, we have no chance of ever having a metal-to-metal contact situation. But if you put that out to 2,000 hours or 2,500 hours, now what you do is eat into some of these protective stages, these barriers that we have towards catastrophic failure.
Investigations Division.
In its final report into the crash of Flight 261, the NTSB concluded that the extended service intervals for the Jackscrews on its MD-80s was a significant contributor to the crash.
Or with any of your supervisors up the chain in the engineering area.
I don't recall any.
With carriers doing anything to save a dime, maintenance, safety, took a back seat. And then one of the shocking things about Alaska is that they were allowed to increase inspection intervals. And it was very shocking because that is the only way we have safety.
The extended maintenance intervals meant that the lack of grease on the jackscrew went undiscovered. But now investigators also wondered if the failure of the jackscrew assembly revealed a basic flaw in the plane's design. They found that the MD-80 broke one of the fundamental rules of aircraft design. It was not fail-safe.
The design philosophy that has made aviation so safe is that we should never ever have a situation in which one catastrophic failure of some component of the airplane causes us to lose the airplane. These backups to the backup, backing up the backups, is why we can get on an airplane with almost 100% assurance that we're going to get where we want to go safely.
There was no backup to the jackscrew and its nut. Engineers never envisaged a situation on the MD-80 where the jackscrew might fail. With inspections every 600 flight hours and replacement every 2,000 hours, the designers did not add an additional redundant backup system.
It was utterly laughable that they said it was a redundant system. There's one screw and there's one nut. That's all there is. It's not redundant.
The MD-80 continues to fly worldwide. Despite the revelation of this dangerous design flaw, the jackscrew assembly has not been redesigned. Inspection intervals have been shortened, but airlines still rely on proper maintenance to prevent the same accident happening again.
Investigations Division.
In its final report, the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the crash of Flight 261 was due to the lack of adequate greasing and the stretched service intervals. When coupled with the design of the jackscrew, these failures led to a completely avoidable accident and the loss of 88 lives. Three years after the crash of Flight 261, the relatives and friends of the dead dedicated a permanent memorial at Port Hueneme, close to the crash site.
Janice Stokes.
I think the best thing and the only thing in our infinite inadequacy of making up for the loss from this life is to say something that we've been able to say on a lot of other accidents to other grieving families, and that is, those deaths will not be in vain. We will not let them be in vain. Every one of those lives will be made to count in terms of making sure that 3, 4, 5, or 10 other people do not die.
Miss Carol Carlson.
Colleen was different She was adventurous, and there's nobody like that in our family. And I don't know what we can do except to remember Colleen and to live our lives now a little bit better for her.
You know, when I was growing up, we didn't wear seatbelts. There weren't even seatbelts in cars. And now we know that we need to wear seatbelts. We didn't know that much about smoking cigarettes, and now we know that we can't smoke cigarettes. Well, there's a lot to learn about airline safety, too.
Ryan Bushy.
None of us are the same anymore. It's like walking into a giant storm, wave after wave forming up, coming in, because it never stops. Grief over the loss of a child is not something I wish on anybody. This plane went down because of neglect. It seems like such an unholy type of loss. What a hard way to die. So an airline can, you know, make more money.
We're not getting any oxygen. We have the terrain alarm. Even our Aero Crew 603.
We are in an emergency.
On the night of the 24th of August 2001, a fully loaded Airbus A330 with 306 people on board ran out of fuel midway over the Atlantic. How could a state-of-the-art computerized airliner suffer such a catastrophic failure?
Mayday, mayday, mayday. We have lost both engines due to fuel starvation. We are gliding now. Well, we're now at 30,000 feet at the rate of descent of 2,000 feet per minute.
May have to ditch in the water.
I need you to put on your life jackets right now.
This film investigates what happened to Air Transat Flight 236.
This is it. It's over. They're just gonna die in the next 5 to 10 minutes.
And the speed's increasing, 203 knots now. It's way too fast.
Everybody, I need you to brace. Oh my God!
August 23, 2001. Toronto International Airport is busy. Air Transat is a charter company that has grown rapidly to become one of the largest airlines in Canada. Midsummer brings fewer business travelers and a holiday atmosphere. Air Transat Flight 236 is bound for Lisbon. Most of the passengers are Canadians visiting Europe or Portuguese immigrants heading home. The plane, a twin-engined Airbus A330, is being flown by a young co-pilot, Dirk de Jager, and an experienced captain, Robert Pichet.
Captain Robert Pichet is somewhat out of the ordinary. Captain Pichet, from the moment he gets his wing, he gets to learn how to fly in the north of the province of Quebec, where the conditions occasionally are very severe.
The flight deck of the A330 is ultra-modern. Banks of computers connected to over 100 onboard sensors constantly monitor the operation of the plane. This film reveals how serious problems can arise when the pilots begin to distrust the computers. Before departure, the computers give no indications of any problems with the Airbus.
236 Heavy, follow A320 Air Canada. Turn left on Romeo and hold short on 24 right.
Roger, follow A320 Air Canada, left on Romeo and hold short of 24 right.
With With the crew of 7, Flight 236 has 306 people on board.
Well, we were married for 4 days, wasn't it?
4 days.
4 days.
4 days. So we had planned to go to Portugal for our honeymoon, and we had booked this flight on Air Transat. And rather quickly, because we hadn't really planned what we were going to do very carefully. So this was the last flight left.
Well, boarded on this flight to go on a 2.5-week vacation with a friend of mine. Obviously, I was very excited, spending 2.5 weeks on the coast of Portugal. A very excited feeling.
Transat 236 Heavy, cleared for takeoff.
240 at 8, cleared for takeoff, 24 right, Transat 236 Heavy.
At 20 minutes past 8, the Airbus A330, loaded with over 47 tons of fuel, leaves Toronto for Lisbon.
V1, rotate.
The weather forecast for the Atlantic crossing is good. Everything runs smoothly on the flight deck, apart from a small adjustment to the route. To avoid congestion, air traffic control directs the flight 60 miles south of its original route. It's a minor alteration, but will later play a crucial role. The passengers settle down for the long crossing.
The reason for our trip to Portugal was a family trip. We were going to a wedding. Otherwise, we would not have gone this year. So instead of just going for 4 days for a wedding, we decided to stay for 2 weeks and throw the wedding in as a kind of family perk and see everybody.
Everything appeared quite normal, and in fact, I had traveled on Air Transat previously and found it not to be very good, and was surprised by the quality of the flight, that it was on time, the plane was newer, and we thought generally it was much better than we had expected it would be.
We're getting to our next checkpoint.
Every 30 minutes across the Atlantic, the crew check their position and fuel consumption against their flight plan.
11.2 tons on the right, 11.2 tons on the left.
Despite the computerized systems, some procedures, like checking the fuel on board, still need to be done by hand.
5.2 tons.
By comparing the amount of fuel in the tanks with the amount the flight started with, the pilots can keep an eye on the fuel consumption.
Fuel check complete. Levels normal for the distance flown.
All right.
For the first 5 hours, everything is routine. The flight crew, Air Transat, and the accident investigators have all declined to be interviewed about what happened next. This film uses known facts about the flight, standard emergency procedures, and expert opinion to reconstruct what took place on Flight 236.
Look, we're getting a warning signal. Oil temp low and oil pressure high on number 2. What?
This warning is the first step in the crisis.
Oil pressure is within normal limits on number 1. Number 2 is slightly high.
The computer display reveals that the oil temperature is low in engine number 2, but the oil pressure is high. It is a very unusual reading. The pilots are puzzled.
I can't see anything here. I'll look in the FCOM.
Okay.
A low oil temperature indication is normally indicative of bad readings, bad sensor. Oil temperatures don't decrease normally, they increase. A low oil temperature would be of no concern. The high oil pressure is a very strange indication. It's very rare. In fact, I've never actually heard of one. It's only indicative of the contamination normally of the oil with fuel. That's not something that's explained in the manuals.
Call the company.
The crew contact Air Transat's maintenance group in Montreal.
Transat 236 to Mirabel Operations.
Mirabel Transat 236. Hi.
Hi, we have a little problem. We're getting the warning oil temp low and oil pressure high on the ECAM for engine number 2. There's nothing in the QRH nor the FCOM. Can you help us out?
I'm looking in the
The
manual.
ground crew have no immediate solution. The pilots must work it out for themselves.
They may have been given some advice on troubleshooting to see if that would help. But ultimately, the pilots are up there on their own. They can get advice from somebody 2,500 miles away, but they can't really fix their problems.
Suggest you keep monitoring your oil levels and see what happens. Advise us on
But because the oil readings are so unusual, the pilots believe they may indicate a computer error. The crew keep monitoring the oil levels. Air Transat 236 continues on track. Then, 20 minutes later, a new warning.
Fuel imbalance warning. Haven't seen that before. Follow all ECAM action. I have air traffic control.
In the Airbus 330, most of the fuel is in large tanks in the wings. The computer has now detected that the fuel level on the right is significantly lower than the left. The crew consult the Airbus flight manual, which recommends they transfer fuel through a special cross-feed valve. Fuel will then flow from one tank to the other. But before opening the cross-feed, the pilots must be sure that the imbalance is not caused by a more serious problem, such as a fuel leak.
Last fuel check was only 15 minutes ago and it was okay. No indication of a fuel leak. Keep going.
Wing crossfeed. On.
On.
Once you begin a cross-feeding procedure to correct a fuel imbalance, restorative action should commence quite quickly. In other words, the situation would not continue to get worse. It would either stabilize immediately and then begin to correct itself.
But the situation is not correcting itself. Unknown to the pilots, there is a major fuel leak in the number 2 engine on the right-hand side of the plane. Flight 236 is in mid-Atlantic, nearly 300 kilometers from the nearest land. "39,000 feet over the Atlantic, nearly 300 kilometers from land, Air Transat Flight 236 is in trouble. Unknown to the pilots, the right engine is leaking fuel. The plane's computer system has thrown up a series of warnings, but the pilots believe these are computer errors.
Have you ever seen something like this before?
No. Never. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, even if there is a leak, it doesn't explain the alarms on the oil system.
And everything was okay at the last fuel check at 30 West. Yeah. Bet you it's a computer problem.
The task of finding out if there is a fuel leak is made harder by the design of the Airbus systems.
The systems monitor hundreds and hundreds of sensors, and they can be affected by such mundane things as a little bit of frost or ice on a sensor can cause it to present bad data. So it's not something that would occur on every single flight, but it's something that we're quite used to dealing with.
There is no warning to show if the fuel level is falling faster than the engines are consuming it. So the pilots receive no immediate indication that there could be a fuel leak.
Fuel quantity isn't rising in the tanks for the right wing.
Check fuel quantity.
Looks very low. Hold on.
When co-pilot Diego carries out the fuel calculations, he discovers something is seriously wrong.
That's much less fuel than we should have. It looks like a fuel leak.
Check again.
Diego finds a disturbing difference.
According to all the gauges, all the tanks in the right wing are way below the level they should be according to the flight plan, and there's hardly anything in the other ones.
What about the trim tank?
There's nothing there either.
Yes?
Hello, first officer here.
Can you come to the cockpit, please?
Sure.
Although Captain Pichet believes he is dealing with a computer problem, he nevertheless decides to ask for a visual check just in case, to see if there could be a fuel leak.
Captain?
Hi. Can you and Karen take some flashlights and go to the windows if you can see anything trailing back from the wings? It'll look like a mist or a stream, and report back immediately.
Okay.
Dirk, I want you to do another complete fuel check, please.
I'm so sorry.
In daylight, the fuel pouring out of the back of the wing would have been clearly visible. But in the dead of night, even with a torch, the fuel leaking from the engine is impossible to see.
The crew evidently realized that the situation was not improving, and at that point they realized that their circumstances were becoming more serious. And I think that there were probably some discussions took place between the two pilots as to what their next course of action should be.
If the computer is correct, then with the amount of fuel remaining, the Airbus will no longer be able to make it to Lisbon. Captain Pichet is forced to make a crucial decision.
We've got to divert. Get on to Oceanic Control. Where's the nearest airfield?
Transat 236 Heavy, Santa Maria Control. Can you advise nearest airfield? We have a possible fuel problem.
The nearest runway is over 300 kilometers away. But with the fuel remaining, Leger's military airbase on the tiny island of Terceira in the Azores should be within reach.
Santa Maria Control, Transat 236 Heavy. Proceed 230, flight level 390 direct. 350 miles to threshold. Are you declaring an emergency?
Stand by, Santa Maria Control.
Not yet. It must be the computer.
Transat 236 Heavy, Santa Maria Control. No assistance required yet.
Flight 236 continues flying south for the next 25 minutes. Everything in the cabin seems normal. But in the cockpit, the fuel readings are getting worse.
Must be the computer.
I've checked. There's nothing in the trim or center tank. And the gauges show only 7.5.
According to the fuel gauges, the plane is using fuel much faster than normal. Whether they believe the gauges or not, the captain has no choice. He must warn air traffic control.
We have to declare a fuel emergency.
Transat 236 Heavy, Santa Maria Control.
Santa Maria Control, Transat 236 Heavy, go ahead.
Transat 236 Heavy, declaring fuel emergency.
I really hope it's a computer bug, because if we land in the Azores with half a plane full of fuel, they'll crucify us.
But at 6:13 a.m., less than an hour from the first fuel alarm, the right-hand engine runs out of fuel and cuts out.
We're losing engine number 2. I don't believe this. Okay, maximum thrust on number 1.
What's going on? Yes, what's happening?
Lights started flickering on and off.
which I thought was kind of odd, strange.
On one engine, the Airbus will not fly at 39,000 feet. They must descend quickly.
Try to transfer fuel from center tank and the trim tank.
Transferring. Fuel quantities reaching 0.
This can't be. I'm not gonna go completely dry on this airplane. All right. We can't stay at 39,000 feet with just one engine. We'll descend to 33,000 to control our speed.
236 Delagis Tower. We have lost one engine. Engine flame out.
Roger, Transat 236. We can see you on primary radar. You are at 135 nautical miles from Lajes Field.
We are 135 nautical miles from Lajes Field.
Well, there's a whole lot of critical things go on. In addition to that, you turn on all the exterior lights so people can see you're in trouble. You have to broadcast your intentions on an emergency frequency so that other people know that you're unable to maintain your altitude. You may be descending through their altitude, so everybody else is now on the lookout for an airplane that's in distress.
For the next 10 minutes, the stricken Airbus continues on its one remaining engine. The pilots still believe that the computer may be partly faulty and that they can make it to Lajes with fuel to spare.
At the end, might be all right.
Fuel gauge is falling fast, though. It's nearly hitting 0.
But 13 minutes after the right-hand engine cut out, and with 130 kilometers still to go, the left engine begins to fail.
We're losing number 1.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. We have lost both engines due to fuel starvation. We are gliding now.
One of the most sophisticated airliners of the modern era, carrying 306 passengers and crew, is now nothing more than a giant glider, drifting steadily down towards the ocean.
Excuse me, can somebody come? Hello?
You can literally hear a pin drop. The exterior, there was no sound in that plane, in that cabin at all.
A lot of people were praying and screaming for God.
My wife was a little hysterical. My best friend was in another world.
The plane was dead silent, except for the people who were very upset.
List of functions we've lost. We have no more stabilizer. Blue and yellow hydraulic. No ADR 2 and 3. No anti-skid. No reversers. Rudder trim. Radio HF 1 and 2.
With the loss of both engines, we have no electrical system. If the engines aren't running, the generators aren't running. So there's no power on the airplane. There is a small device, it's called a ram air turbine. It will deploy from underneath the fuselage near the wing fairing. And it's a small propeller that deploys out the bottom of the fuselage and it spins in the wind. And that small propeller will provide very limited electrical and hydraulic systems to run the aircraft. In other words, although it's a glider, at least it's a controllable glider.
Calculate how far we can go with our glide angle, will you?
Well, we're now at 30,000 feet at the rate of descent of 2,000 feet per minute. We can hang on for 14 or 15 minutes.
What? I don't want to die on an honeymoon.
I was just trying to calm her down, like try and reassure her that everything would be okay.
It's a very big struggle to stay calm when you're considering your own death.
Without power, the plane loses 1,000 feet in height for every 5 kilometers it travels forward. They can reach the Azores, but if the pilots get their calculations wrong, they may face a forced landing on the water.
Not sure we can make it to Lajes.
Air Air Transat Flight 236 is now drifting without fuel over the Atlantic. Although their initial calculations show that the plane should make it to Algiers, Captain Pichet must now follow standard emergency procedure for a passenger jet over water.
Prepare the cabin.
The cabin's slowly depressurizing.
We need to put our oxygen masks on.
The loss of engine power means the cabin soon depressurizes.
Everybody, please, I need your attention. We're preparing to ditch the plane. I need you to put on your life jackets right now.
Within probably, I'd say, 2 minutes, I saw flight attendants with life jackets in their hand running down the aisles. And obviously, that was a sign of fear. What was happening was the first question that popped in my mind.
I just need to tie this up like that.
You don't really know what to think, but people did start to panic at that point when they were told to put on life jackets.
This isn't working. No, it's all right. Please remain. Please keep her calm. It's not working.
My best friend was talking to his father. His father died 3 years ago. But he's talking to him because he thought for sure he was going to be joining him. And I just kept the same reiteration. Oh, it's okay, one hand on one leg, one hand on the other, both their arms clenched to mine, kind of looking at my in-laws, blinking. It's okay, it's nothing.
I kept thinking that if the plane did hit water, that we would survive. I was so convinced that we would survive no matter what happened to the plane that I was probably delusional.
Fear just suddenly just kicked in from my toes straight up to my head. At that point, they started instructing us and giving us instructions of what to do in this procedure. Take off your shoes was one of them. Don't inflate your life jacket until we hit the water. Get into this position when we hit the water. It was a lot of, it wasn't like ifs or maybes. This was going to happen. This is the real deal.
Ditching a large passenger jet on the water presents severe hazards. If the Airbus 330 has to make a forced landing, the chances of survival are bleak.
In my personal opinion, I don't think these airplanes would make very good boats. Typically, an airplane with a low-mounted tail like this, as it enters the water, one of the first things that's going to hit the water is the tail. And it's probably going to be ripped right off, and the fuselage is probably going to open right about there.
In 1996, a Boeing 767 ran out of fuel off the coast of East Africa. Its last moments were caught on amateur video and reveal what happens when an airliner attempts a controlled landing on water. Of the 175 people on the Ethiopian Airways jet, only 50 survived.
The chances of it surviving a ditching and floating for very long are not very good.
If Air Transat Flight 236 has to carry out a similar maneuver, it faces an equally grave outcome. With over 100 kilometers before they reach the Azores, the pilots face a long and difficult maneuver. They need to keep the plane gliding for more than 50 minutes to reach the Azores.
There's very little time for any emotions at all. You're just so focused on the mission at hand. It's a life or death situation, of course, but your intention is to get it there. You're not thinking about the alternatives, but you're fully focused on getting the airplane to its destination.
Transat 236 Heavy to Lajes Tower. Lajes Tower receiving Transat 236 Heavy.
Do you have us
On radar, Transat 236. We have you on primary radar. Confirm you're at 80 miles out. Your heading is good.
Transat 236 Heavy, Lajes Tower, we are trying to make the runway. Please describe runway heading and length.
Lajes Tower, Transat 236 Heavy. Runway is 33 and 10,865 feet long. Airport dead ahead on your present heading. Please advise when you have it in sight.
Transat 236 Heavy, we cannot see the airport. We will tell you when we can.
As the minutes tick by, the long wait for those on board is agonizing.
That's it. This is it. It's over. You're just gonna die in the next 5 to 10 minutes.
I had contemplated the idea that we would die, certainly. And kind of I think in that moment you can accept it more than you think you would accept it.
I never thought I was gonna die. I was in a little bit of a state of distress. I did my best not to show it, to try to keep the cool, calm, and collected, but there was certain times where I wasn't sure if we would make it.
The torture of the whole fact that you're gonna die, which I totally thought I was going to, is worse to me than dying. If I'm gonna die, just kill me now. Just get a gun and shoot me, or just let this plane go down and nosedive into the ocean and then just die instantly.
On the ground, emergency services prepare for the crash landing of a fully loaded airliner. With 20 kilometers to go, the crew now prepare for the most dangerous part of the operation, getting their plane on the runway in one piece.
6 Heavy to Lajes Tower. Do you have our distance from threshold now, and weather, please?
Roger, Transat 236 Heavy. You are 8 miles out according to primary radar. Airspeed 280 knots according to our readings. Visibility unlimited. You should have the airport in sight.
Negative, Lajes Tower. Until now, we cannot see the runway.
There is no room for error. Without power, the pilots have only one chance at landing. If they miss or overshoot the runway, the results could be catastrophic.
I got it. Just to the right. Minimum RAT speed is 140 knots. Maximum speed for gravity gear extension, 200 knots.
I'm not lowering the gear until the last minute, okay?
Okay.
The crew struggle to lose height and speed for landing.
Roger, Lajes. 6 nautical miles.
Let's open the slats. It'll slow us down a bit.
Slats out and locked.
As they approach the runway, their speed increases dangerously. Too fast and they could roll off the end of the runway.
Lower the gear.
Hold on. Speed is about 200. All right. I stabilize the speed. Can you give me a landing speed, please?
No engine, no flaps. Ideal approach speed is 170 knots. We're too fast.
Yes. But the runway is very long.
Captain Pichet now performs a difficult series of swerving maneuvers to slow the plane down for landing.
The plane was almost on a 45-degree angle. I thought it was just gonna flip over and just nosedive straight down.
The plane was circling around the island to slow down. So then we saw land and then we saw water. And when I saw water again, it really struck me that, our chance for survival had maybe was gone.
The runway is long. Yeah, sure, but at the end there's a 400-foot cliff. If we don't stop in enough time, we're toast. We're dead.
The crew line up the giant Airbus for final approach.
Landing gear down and locked. 3 green. No flaps. Only the emergency brakes. No spoilers, no reverse thrust. 4,000 feet, 195 knots. "3,000 feet, 197 knots. "2,000 feet, 200 knots.
Alert the cabin.
Cabin crew, 1 minute to landing.
Hang on. Let's go.
Vertical speed at 3,000 feet per minute. We're going way too fast. And the speed's increasing, 203 knots now. It's way too fast. 1,000 feet, 201 knots.
Try to get the nose up. We'll ride fast.
But even if the crew can get the Airbus on the runway, they face a further problem. Without engines, the normal procedures for braking are severely restricted. For Flight 236, the danger is far from over. The pilots must land the plane without power and somehow get it to stop.
Everybody, I need you to brace. Hang on.
The Airbus hits hard at high speed.
The tires have blown.
Captain Pichet tries to hold the nose down. After bursting 8 tires, the plane finally stops in the middle of the runway.
What we say, we made it! We made it! We made it! Yeah, we made it, yeah!
Come on, everybody, get out of the plane right now. Let's go. Come on, come on.
Told you we'd make it.
I just wanted to get out of this airplane quickly. I jumped, I hit the ground hard. I don't think my rear end actually even touched the chute at all.
I didn't slide down the slide. I ran down it. And they're just, get out, get out, get out. So you're just running out of this aircraft.
What in God's name just happened? I fell down to the ground, literally, and I started crying.
I mean, once you're off the plane and you're evacuated, you want to know what happened.
Pichet and de Jager had flown their Airbus without power further than any passenger jets in history. As news of their remarkable achievements spread around the world, they found themselves reluctant heroes.
You don't have time really to think about anything else than taking care of the safety of your passenger, you know. That's your main goal, and since we didn't have any engine, the other main goal was to make the landing safely. So at that time, I guess the experience came in, you know, with the help of my colleague. That's why we made a successful landing.
You train for the worst, but you never know how you'll deal with situations like this. And reflecting afterwards, I feel we dealt in the most professional and complete manner we could.
A feeling of being grateful to see all the passengers were okay.
You know, something like this happened, you never know what is going to happen really. I mean, you start not to believe it. I mean, makes no sense that a big jet with 2 engines has no more power with 300 people on board, you know.
But although the public story was a success, disturbing questions remained. Why had a highly sophisticated airliner run out of fuel? What exactly had happened to Flight 236? Away from the cameras, An accident investigation began immediately by the Portuguese, Canadian, and French transport authorities. Initial checks quickly confirmed that all the fuel tanks of the Airbus were indeed empty. But to lose more than 17 tons of fuel in such a short space of time meant they'd had a major leak. The question was, where? Engineers examined the fuel system, searching for faults in the tanks and the fuel lines. It wasn't long before they found what they were looking for, just by the right engine.
In this particular case, you had a hydraulic tube that's relatively small by comparison to the larger fuel tube. And the hydraulic tube, due possibly to pulsations in the hydraulic system, were abrading against the larger tube. And eventually the larger tube had a leak in it, and the leak, or not the leak itself, but the hole eventually possibly led into a fracture of the tube, allowing this massive fuel flow outside of the engine.
The investigators began checking Air Transat maintenance records. They discovered that on the 17th of August, 5 days before the flight, Air Transat had removed the right-hand engine for maintenance and installed a replacement unit sent by Rolls-Royce. But as they analyzed the repair logs for the engine, they uncovered a shocking mistake. This was not a case of faulty design, but of faulty maintenance. Rolls-Royce had supplied the engine without a hydraulic pump assembly. To overcome this, Transat mechanics had used the parts from an older engine. But they didn't fit properly, and the pipes had been rubbing together for 5 days, until, midway over the Atlantic, one finally broke.
The engine was delivered minus these two tubes and a bracket. That the purpose of that bracket was to maintain adequate clearance. So if they took the bracket off the old engine and put it on the new engine, is that the pipes would be locked together so that they could possibly abrade. So the mechanics, now I can't fault them, but they were not given specific instructions to verify the 3mm clearance.
As investigators questioned Air Transat mechanics, they found more disturbing evidence of malpractice. The chief mechanic testified that he had been concerned about the substitution of another hydraulic assembly. 5 days before the accident, he raised his concerns with his superior. He was told that it would cost too much to have the aircraft waiting for the missing parts and to go ahead with the substitution. The replacement parts only differed from the correct ones by a few millimeters, but it was a difference that almost cost 306 lives. A few days after the accident, Air Transat publicly accepted responsibility for the faulty maintenance.
We have to realize that there was a small mistake made in terms of changing the pump. We installed it, but then some pipes, so to speak, were needed to be connected to the pump, and there was a mismatch.
The immediate consequences for Air Transat in that event was that they got to pay a fine of $250,000, which was the highest ever in Canada, for an error that could have been prevented.
How someone that is supposed to be qualified in their job can put the wrong part onto an engine and risk 300 people's lives is beyond me.
This incident is a very strong reminder that regulation is important and safety is important, and lives will be lost in the absence of that. And they're real lives. It's not just, this imaginary figure in your head of 300 people. It's real people who suffer and continue to suffer. If it hadn't been us suffering, it would have been our families.
This was by no means the end of the story. Investigators now turn their attention to the cockpit itself. What role had the crew played in the events of August the 24th? Could they have done more to avert the crisis? Key questions remained unanswered. Questions about what happened on the flight deck. The investigation into Air Transat Flight 236 discovered that basic maintenance errors had led to the fuel leak. Air Transat accepted responsibility and were heavily fined. But the focus now turned on the flight deck and the performance of the crew. What part did they play in the fuel loss?
Wing crossfeed. On.
On.
When the crew opened the crossfeed valve to transfer fuel from the left wing tank to the right, they lost 17 tons of fuel in less than 30 minutes. Yet they failed to close the crossfeed valve and prevent further loss.
Mayday, mayday. We have lost both engines due to fuel starvation. We are gliding now.
In the days after the incident, Captain Robert Pichet and Dirk de Jager were called before the inquiry and asked in detail about their actions. More than 2 years later, these findings have still not been published. What follows are possible explanations for the course of events that night, based on known facts and expert opinion.
Oil temp low and oil pressure high on number 2.
The warnings of high oil pressure and low oil temperature from the engine on the right wing would not have led the pilots to suspect that there was already a major fuel leak.
The indications that were being presented with respect to the oil system would probably not give the crew any indications. They may have questioned what was causing the erroneous or strange indications, but there's nothing certainly in my mind or their training, I think, that would have triggered them to suspect that a fuel system might be involved.
Bet you it's a computer problem.
But although the pilots thought they had a computer error, the oil warnings were actually correct and were the first indication of a much more serious problem.
Fuel imbalance warning. Haven't seen that before.
When the fuel imbalance warning came up 20 minutes later, showing less fuel in the right wing than the left, it seemed unconnected with the oil alarms. This could have reinforced Captain Pichet's idea that he was facing a series of computer errors.
Do not apply this procedure if a fuel leak is suspected.
Despite his doubts, Captain Pichet was obliged to follow Airbus procedure to correct the imbalance. He opened the crossfeed valve.
Wing crossfeed. On.
But was following the checklist enough?
You just can't idly flip switches in response to commands from the computers and anticipate that all will be well at the end of it. Once the checklist is complete, we can sit there fat, dumb, and happy. That's not the case at all. You got to keep second guessing it. Is that right? Did we do the right checklist? Have we got the results that we need?
Once the pilots calculated the high rate of fuel loss, they should have suspected a major leak.
Transat 236 Heavy declaring fuel emergency.
By the time they had confirmed the leak, their options were severely limited.
They were flying blind, as it were. There was no checklist information provided to them. They assumed that once they had engaged in this procedure that the situation would resolve itself, and it wasn't. Now they had a choice. Do I close the crossfeed and see what happens, or do I leave the crossfeed open as the fuel imbalance checklist has dictated, and maybe the situation will correct itself? The crew wasn't really sure. It wasn't an eventuality. It wasn't a situation that they had been trained for, I'm sure. They were in new ground with really no guidance to help them. If they left the crossfeed open, or whether they closed the crossfeed, I would only be speculating as to what changes it might have resulted in the outcome in this event.
Captain Pichet believed for a long time that he was facing a computer error. It was only when the engines finally stopped that he had to accept the fuel leak was genuine. The technological complexity of modern aircraft can help to make them safer and more reliable, but it can also lead to the problems that nearly brought catastrophe to Air Transat 236. Discrepancies in replacement parts led to a fuel leak. Distrust of computers led the crew to misread the situation. These errors combined to have huge implications. Only because air traffic control initially sent the plane 60 miles south to avoid congestion was Flight 236 close enough to the Azores when the crisis struck. Otherwise, it would have had to ditch in the ocean. The investigation remains unpublished. Airbus blamed the pilots for mishandling the fuel leak. Robert Pichet and Dirk de Jager continued to fly with Air Transat. In August 2002, they received the highest honors of the Airline Pilots Association for the longest glide ever accomplished in a passenger airline. After the accident, Airbus modified its checklist in the event of fuel imbalance. From now on, the computer checks all the fuel levels on board against the flight plan. It now gives a clear warning if more fuel is being lost than the engines can consume. Rolls-Royce has reissued a service bulletin, alerting all its clients of the incompatibility of two almost similar parts. For the passengers trapped on Flight 236, the trauma has left them with mixed feelings.
All right, I stabilized the speed.
This accident wasn't caused by simply one omission by any one individual, as is typical of most aircraft accidents. There's a whole chain of events, a whole series of events that lead to the incident or to the accident, and this accident was no different.
Whatever the circumstances are, the pressure that he was under is tremendous. He got that plane down safely, only blew out 8 of the 12 tires, and saved 300 people. He saved 300 people's lives.
Captain Pichet saved our lives, and whether or not he made an error, or if there was a failure of a computer, it doesn't really matter because we're alive.
Do I think he's a hero? No. Do I think he's a hell of a pilot? Yes.
Thank God the islands of the Azores were there and basically saved our lives. But if that fuel pump broke 5 minutes beforehand, we would have ended up into the water, and I probably wouldn't be here to tell the story.